You like walk around a corner in Columbus and then two shadowy figures come out, one with a lead pipe. Hey, I heard you've been talking about Eitzel.
And they actually look like Eitzel and Vudi, like with the hats and like the trench coats. Like there's some good like publicity shots of them. Like they look like guys that, you'd be like, whoa, like don't go down that alley,
If there's
Anyway.
one thing I don't think you need to worry about with American Music Club fans, it's violence.
Welcome to Backtracking, the show where two old friends take a second listen to influential bands' catalogs track by track. I'm J. William Hall.
And I'm Dan Fiden. We'll be taking this journey together, providing context, both personal and historical, on some legendary bands. For our second season, we've picked none other than pioneering indie rockers American Music Club.
Today on Backtracking, we're taking the slow boat back to 1985, and maybe even a little bit before that. Dig deep into American Music Club's debut full-length, Restless Stranger. Released in January of 1985 on Grifter, the album didn't receive much of a reception from critics, record buyers, or even from the band, various members of which disavowed the album frequently over the years. But when you're backtracking, you've got to begin with the beginning. There's no debate. That's what The Restless Stranger is for AMC. It's the beginning.
It sure is, JW. But before the beginning, we need to introduce the band itself. First and foremost, there's Mark Eitzel, singer, songwriter, and guitarist for AMC. And while he'll eventually move into the role of band leader, that isn't quite the case just yet. Next, we have guitarist Mark Vudi Pankler. Next, we have Danny Pearson, AMC's bassist. And rounding things out for the Restless Stranger era of the band, we have Matt Norelli on drums and Brad Johnson on keyboards. After lineup instability in the early version of AMC that made the migration from Ohio out west, Vudi insisted to Eitzel that he needed a real band and assembled this lineup for him. Eitzel was pleased.
At least for a while. There was enough stability in this lineup that AMC approached local producer, engineer, and studio owner Tom Mallon, a man who would figure prominently in the band's early years, to record a demo. Mallon was known for making studio time affordable for Bay Area bands that he thought were interesting, and AMC fit the bill. The band slogged through difficult sessions and would complete a demo that featured a number of the songs that would eventually find their way onto The Restless Stranger. When Mallon decided to start his own label, Grifter, he deemed it time to record a full-length AMC record for the label. AMC regrouped for what became difficult sessions, spearheaded by the now domineering and single-sighted Tom Mallon. Nonetheless, Mallon pounded the band into submission, and the result is the band's debut.
So what else was pounded into submission in the late 1984, early 85 era? The Terminator attempted to pound Sarah Connor into submission. Incumbent Ronald Reagan succeeded in pounding Democrat challenger Walter Mondale in the presidential election. And Bob Geldof and his merry band of Brits pounded famine into submission with sweet, sweet melodies, finally answering the ages-old question, do the Africans even know it's Christmas after all? Yes, Bob. Yes, they do. Okay, J-Dub, here we are. Episode in season 2.
Yes.
American Music Club. How does it feel?
It's been a long journey to get here.
Yeah.
And my journey with American Music Club began about 1990.
1990.
Trying to pinpoint, like, how did I find out about American Music Club?
Yeah.
And
So wait, hold on. Paint a picture for us. Paint a picture for us, J-Dub. Listen, 1990. In 1990, as you know, backtracking is about the personal and the historical. And in 1990, I was a freshman or sophomore in college. Or no, freshman or sophomore in high school.
Yes.
Deep into my Rush thrall, by the way. To connect it to season 1. That was like, right around the peak of my Rush fandom. So you were discovering American Music Club. Tell me, paint the picture. Where were you? How old were you?
So it was summer of 1990. It was hot.
Hot summer. Yeah.
Real hot summer.
Human.
So I'm in my hometown. I was I believe between my junior and senior year of high school. I'm in my hometown. Grew up in a small to mid-sized college town.
Yeah.
And there's a couple record stores in town, and I spent a lot of time in those record stores
Yeah.
going through everything.
Now,
And
what was the
so
record store? What were the names of the stores?
the record store that I frequented was Backstreet Records, which was at
Of course it
the old
was.
the old Regency Mall, locally as the
Yeah.
Old Mall or the Small Mall.
Okay.
To
Okay.
this day, the Big Mall is the one that was built in 1978, or the New Mall, just up the road.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Backstreet Records was at the Old Mall.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
it was within walking distance of my house, even though I had to
Yeah.
scale a barbed wire topped uh, chain link fence to
Yeah.
get there.
Yeah.
But I would go and I would
It's
look through
difficult growing up in the
every single record, every single CD, every single cassette, like you know. And
Yeah.
so I would go through the cutout bins, the bargain bins,
Yeah.
looking at whatever vinyl they might happen to have in there. And one day I'm holding it in my hands.
Yeah. Look
Listeners,
at
you can't see this, but Dan can see it because we're on the video.
yeah.
Um, it is the American Music Club album, California. It was
You
in the
is
bargain.
that the actual one that you bought?
Yeah,
Still
yeah.
in the shrink wrap?
It says Backstreet Records, $2.99.
$2.99. That is amazing.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
$2.99. And so I was struck by the cover.
Yeah, beautiful cover. Beautiful
Beautiful
cover.
cover. And
Yeah.
and I was just kind of like, oh, that's cool, $2.99, I'll give it a shot. I hadn't heard
Yeah.
of, I read the back and I hadn't heard of, anything about
And
it.
yeah.
And
Yeah. And
and
what
so
kind of music were you into at this, in this era? Tell me about some of the other touchstones for you.
so I was there was this amazing radio station that existed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area.
Yeah.
And
Greater
and
Pitt.
I was shocked to learn as an adult that this station in this particular format was only there for like 2 years. But those 2 years were when I was in like ninth, 10th, maybe a little bit of
Yeah.
11th grade. It was called WXXP, and
Yeah.
Double X played
Yeah.
alternative music. Although at the time I don't think we called it alternative. We called it
Yeah.
college rock or whatever.
Yeah.
So it was REM, it was the Smiths, it was Echo and the Bunnymen, it was The Cure, it was
Yeah.
New Order, all of
Yeah.
those major 80s alternative bands. But
Yeah.
they also played, a lot of other obscure-ish stuff. And
But it was more on the new wave end than it was on the punk end, probably. Is that a fair thing
yeah,
to say?
I think that
Yeah.
is fair to say. It was more like like stuff that could be considered like indie pop, or
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, they
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
major acts, but there was a ton of stuff that I got turned on to from that station. I would play it all night while I was sleeping.
Yeah.
I would tape, try to, tape songs off that station they were playing on the radio or whatever. And but right around this time I'm trying to so I would say REM kind of
Yeah.
got me interested in like more of like folk rock, or
Yeah. So this
things
is
that were like
like
leaning.
is this like Fables of the Reconstruction era REM are we talking about? Or where are we in the REM catalog? Because I'm not a huge REM fan, but they change a lot over the years. And my recollection is there's like kind of a couple of records in the REM catalog that were real inflection points for them in terms of like how well known they were in the mainstream. But this is before any of that, right?
Yeah, this was
Before
probably like
Place to
this was
Stand,
like
and that,
no, this was Life's Rich Pageant era. So this
yeah,
was like Fall on
okay,
Me, Begin to
yeah,
Begin. Fables of the
yeah,
Reconstruction was just prior to that, but they had
okay,
sort of like embraced the kind of folk, like there
yeah,
were acoustic instruments and whatever, and they
yeah,
were doing kind of this indie folk,
yep,
but it was still rock, but you know what I mean. So
yeah,
anyway,
yeah,
I had started to kind of like get drawn towards those types of sounds. And so when I put this American Music Club California album on for the first time, the first thing I heard is the pedal steel
Yeah.
opening to Firefly. And I
Yeah.
was kind of like, oh, this is like a country band, And so like
Yeah. Yeah.
to the album, got interested in it. Then sometime later that year, maybe 6 months later or something, I'm at the same record store, Backstreet Records at the Regency Mall, the old mall, and I'm looking through the bargain, you know, bins, and what do I see? It's
Wow.
another American Music Club album, and this is the actual album I'm holding up for the
Yeah.
camera.
Yeah.
So it's Engine,
Yeah.
and so I was like, oh, I gotta pick
Amazing.
that up, and
Yeah.
and that's the one that I was like, I'm hooked. I love this
Yeah.
band.
Yeah.
And then I remember seeing I used to go into the record store and just pick up like the alternative press magazine or whatever and look through
Yep.
the lists of like upcoming releases.
Yeah.
And I saw that they were going to release a new album called Everclear. And this was when I was
Yeah.
a freshman at in college.
Yeah.
And
That's right.
so anyway, that's
So,
long-winded
so
story.
you were a fan even like back in high school.
Yeah, I mean, I was the first, I had never heard of them. Like
Yeah.
I don't remember them being played on that radio station, maybe
Yeah.
they were, but I didn't notice them.
It's a safe
Um,
bet that they weren't.
yeah, I thought it was just kind of like, oh, it's this obscure country band
Yeah. Yeah.
thing. And but then Everclear came out and it got a lot more attention, and I think their profile kind of changed at that point a little bit, but
Yeah.
we'll get to that. We'll get to that on the
We
Everclear
will.
episode.
We will. There's so much. There's so much to get to here. So, J Dub, why don't we before we go too far down memory lane here?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of prehistory of American Music Club? It is a very rich, very complicated, and unfortunately not an extraordinarily well documented prehistory. But I want to talk about it a little bit because I think a lot of the drama, a lot of the early influences of Eitzel are important to hit on, really, especially when we're going to talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is their debut album, The Restless Stranger. Um, because the band evolves a ton after. I mean, the band evolves. I think what we're going to find is the band evolves a lot over the course of their career, but there really is a pretty substantial evolution. I would argue after The Restless Stranger, and what you're getting in The Restless Stranger is kind of roughly 50% of like where Eitzel was coming from and 50% of where the band is going to. It is really I would argue this is a very transitional album, but I want to before we get into that, let's just talk about the prehistory. So, Eitzel, again, I'm going to give a huge thank you to Sean Body, the author of Wish the World Away, Mark Eitzel and the American Music Club. This was a book that came out, gosh, in the late 90s, I'm going to say. I read many, 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 many years ago and picked it back up to prepare for the podcast. Um, it is about as exhaustive a work of history on Eitzel and American Music Club as exists out there. There is not a ton available online. This book is really terrific. So if you can find a copy, I highly recommend you pick it up.
I was gonna say a couple of things. One, I'm
Okay.
ashamed. I'm
You're
ashamed
ashamed?
that I don't own this book
Did you
already.
ever read this book?
No, I've never read it.
Really?
No.
Wow.
Like, I
Yeah.
don't remember when it came out exactly, but somehow I never picked it up and I never read it. And I'm ashamed, especially now, because I want to make, this is sort of a general disclaimer. You know, you and I have both done
Yeah.
extensive research, as extensive as Google and YouTube and
Yeah.
whatever online haunts we could try to track
Yeah.
down what we can about American Music Club. But That's not to say that we're always going to be 100%
No, we're gonna be
accurate.
wrong. We're gonna get some things wrong. I really, really hope that if there's anyone out there who is more expert than us in the band, and I have no doubt there are many people out there who fit that bill, or people who are affiliated with the band in some way, and they want to correct anything, please do it. We will absolutely correct it in the next episode of the podcast. We would love to talk to you and make sure we're getting the history right. And I think probably before we dig in, it's also worth saying Raf and I talked about this a lot in the first season of Backtracking. We chose American Music Club, Jay William and I, because we sincerely love this band. And our love for this band goes beyond kind of, I like the band pretty well. They're one of my favorite bands. This is a band that, for me, there was a period of time in my life where I was genuinely obsessed with this band. And I wanted to listen to everything I could that they ever put out. I wanted to know the catalog backwards and forwards. I was a huge fan. And I think that the same was true for Jay William. We are not going to say
Absolutely.
that every recording and every track on every album is good, because that's just not the case for any band. So there will
Maybe
be
you won't. Maybe you
there
won't.
will be moments where I'm going to be critical. I'll tell you there are going to be some today. Um, but that's not to say that we don't genuinely love this band. We're just trying to be honest and to really understand their evolution as a band as much as possible. That's what Backtracking is all about. So we're doing this from a place of love. We want to get it all right, but we also want to be honest. Contact us if we're getting anything wrong. If you disagree with our analysis on any of these songs, please reach out and let us know. That's not to say that you're going to convince me that, for example, you know, I'm in Heaven Now is the greatest American Music Club song that was ever done. I think, we're going to quibble about that. But we're talking about it as real enthusiasts. So anyway, before we spend too much time with preamble, Jay William, we got to get into prehistory. So Mark Eitzel, it's impossible to talk about American Music Club, or it's difficult to talk about American Music Club and really extricate it from Mark Eitzel and it being a Mark Eitzel vehicle. It is more than just a Mark Eitzel vehicle, but he is really the driving force of this band over the course of their career. Do you think that's a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I mean, the band was built around his songs, you know. I mean, but of course, like any band where you have a semi or stable lineup, or you have
Yeah.
musicians who are, like, of
Yeah.
course, that's all part of the DNA of the band, and that's why, the band stuff is distinct and different from his solo stuff, later
That's
on or
right.
whatever. It's a different group of musicians working on it. Sure.
That's right. But so to talk about the early history of American Music Club, I think you've got to kind of focus on Mark Eitzel. So Eitzel grew up, his father was kind of affiliated with the military. He was some kind of a military contractor. And as a result, he and his family moved all over the world. So he grew up in the UK. He spent time in Taiwan, I believe. Lived in various places around the country in the U.S. Um, Grew up with one sister, a mother, and a father. Right from the telling in the Wish the World Away book, very distant relationship with his parents, and kind of a very lonely childhood as a result of always kind of being moving from place to place. Um, Eitzel, long story short, Eitzel ends up in Columbus, Ohio. And Columbus, Ohio is really where he starts his college career. And it's also really where he starts his performance and music career. During his time in Columbus, this is the early 80s, right? Late 70s, early 80s. He becomes enthralled primarily with the kind of punk avant-garde community. And so
Right.
the things that he was doing in and around Columbus, the places he was hanging out, the people he was kind of collaborating with, and the kinds of performances that he was doing really were much more akin to a kind of a, I'm gonna say Laurie Anderson than like what AMC fans might think of as the later, more slowcore and Americana influenced music of American Music Club. I'll pause, Jay William. Do you think that I'm getting that roughly correct?
Yeah, that's my impression as well. And I live in Columbus now, and so like I have a little bit of residual knowledge of, I've
Yeah,
heard tale of this era of Columbus, and what you might call the indie community or whatever, that's sort of
yeah,
like ballooned up around that time. And um yeah, one of I don't remember which source I saw this in, but I know that Eitzel said at one point that one of the key figures that sort of ignited his artistic
yeah,
desire or whatever was this guy named Ron House, who is like local rock legend, is
yeah.
still here, is still doing it.
Really?
Is very his style is what did you say earlier? You said something
I said
um,
Laurie Anderson, but
well,
like punk and avant-garde. I'm thinking of the kind of New York late 70s. There's
yes.
punk, but then there are also these much more arty, almost performance art kind of
Well, and
people who are in.
Ohio in general was fertile ground for that kind of thing. Devo,
Really?
came out of Ohio in the 70s. Pere Ubu,
Yeah.
like in the late 70s. And so those guys were up more, Cleveland, Akron area or whatever, but they were playing Columbus a lot. And so I think there was
Yeah.
all of this kind of like pollination going on. And,
Yeah.
a town like Columbus, especially at that time, not a major media market,
Yeah.
passed over by many and most
Yeah.
touring bands.
Yeah.
I think, there was a lot of boredom probably, like,
Yeah.
kind of baked in. And so I think that all of those things were ingredients that sort of like built up this scene. And, guys like Ron House and,
Yeah.
I don't have extensive knowledge, but like, they were doing this more kind of like, punk influenced, but like kind of confrontational and kind of like,
Yeah. Yeah.
aggressive in a way,
Yeah.
like, but super arty and super, and
Yeah.
Eitzel, that's where he sprouted wings,
Yeah, that's right. And you really do get a sense of that. I would argue that that never really left him throughout the career,
Yeah,
but
that performative kind of,
yeah,
stage
I mean,
presence.
but I think there's this really interesting element in Eitzel that I would argue probably connects to those early influences in Columbus, those early almost performance art influences, where there is an over the top performance element that's very challenging to the audience,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
And then there's also this, I think, undisguised admiration and I would argue aspiration for a much more traditional crooner performer, right?
Right.
Most acutely captured, obviously, in Johnny Mathis's Feet, a seminal Eitzel composition. And I think that it's important to understand both of those things in Eitzel as you kind of watch him mature as a songwriter and as a performer. Right, he never really loses that kind of like punk avant garde. I'm going to do something on stage that is not discernible as art and is maybe offensive to you, and that's kind of the art that
Yeah.
I'm doing.
It
But then
it
there's
makes
also this
you
like
uncomfortable.
yeah, but there's also this, I wanna write the love song that everyone is gonna be moved by, and I wanna sing it on stage in Vegas. And I think those 2 things are kind of always in competition in Eitzel, which is
Mhm.
really, especially kind of mid-career, later career, I think, yields really, really interesting fruit. But when you think about the earliest recordings, I think you really have to think about that young kind of 20, 21, 22, 23-year-old Mark Eitzel, who's primarily influenced by this kind of punk, avant-garde art, spoken word aesthetic that he developed in Columbus. So played in some bands in Columbus, kind of punk type bands. Eventually put together what was the first version of American Music Club.
Well,
And
no, you can't just
okay,
skip over the punk bands.
do me.
Like, did
Okay,
you did you go and listen? Did you listen to the recordings of his first, like, his first band was the Cowboys,
the
and
Cowboys, yes.
and they put out a single, one single. That's it, A
Okay,
side, B side. Both, you can find them. They're both out there on
yeah.
YouTube. So, first of all, I read or something that Ron House was actually directly involved in this
Oh,
release. I
really?
think yeah, this was his like indie record label that he was starting at that time. Um, I don't have it on my notes what the name of it was. It's something House Records or whatever. But so first of all, the voice, like, you can't even, like, that doesn't, you can't even recognize that. Is it Mark Eitzel singing? Like, I can't
You don't even
say
know.
for sure just listening
Yeah,
to it. Like, the voice is so different, it's higher, and like, and it's obviously a little more it's, super lo-fi, like
yeah,
suitably snotty, kind of punk. It has a great line in it. You say teenage life is the best. I look at the future, I get depressed. It's like, that's
it's
awesome.
so good.
Like, the
It's
whole,
so
I mean,
classic kind of first wave punk, you know?
it's so raw and lo-fi and DIY and just all of that stuff, and those are things that are hallmarks of that, like,
Yeah,
Columbus indie scene, coming up through the 80s into the 90s into the, like, DIY is baked in,
yeah, yeah,
um so that's what I hear. Like, when I hear this, I'm like, oh my gosh. And then the B side is like this sort of like loping punk reggae kind of
yeah.
thing, but also great. So the A side, what is it? Teenage Life, and then the B side is Supermarket.
Where am I going to be? Up top in a supermarket. Mommy, mommy, please hold my hand. They're pushing me in a basket. I can't move. I don't understand. Put your hands on your face and stay in your place.
Yeah.
And it's actually like kind of catchy, and I don't know, but both of them were
Go find it. They're
fascinating as,
available on they're available on YouTube. We can put the links in the show notes
yeah,
if you wanna go hear 'em.
yeah. And it's amazing, like, that's the starting point for Eitzel,
Right,
and then
right.
next band that he had, the Naked Skinnies,
Yeah,
um they put out a single, and you can hear the change immediately. Like, this was where, I know, like, I'd read interviews with him where he talked about Joy Division,
yeah.
being an influence early on, and I didn't, necessarily hear that,
Did you
because but when you listen to this, it's like, oh, okay, I hear that.
And it's hatred, a distinct vision. All my life for someone to talk to. All my life for someone to talk to. All my life for someone to talk to. All my life for someone to talk to.
I wanted to talk to you about this because Joy Division comes up so many times when you read about Eitzel in this era and you read about their music in this era, AMC's music in this era, even off of The Restless Stranger.
Mhm.
And I am not a huge I've never really been a Joy Division fan.
Mhm.
I just am passingly familiar with the music, and it never really strikes me as anything that it has a discernible influence on Eitzel, even in the earliest era. But I wanted to know, as somebody who knows Joy Division quite a bit better than I do you pick it up? But it sounds like you pick it up in the Naked Skinnies. Do you pick it up in the later stuff?
I think, like, maybe there are a couple things on Restless Stranger that you could maybe point to, like,
Yeah.
sometimes it's more about how he's singing it. It's like, he's got that low, baritone voice
Yeah.
that sort of is in the same register as Ian Curtis kind of thing. And so I think there are
Yeah.
times, depending on what he's singing, where it's like you can hear that element to it. Yeah, like you can definitely hear it if you listen to this
Yeah.
Naked Skinny song. It's
Okay.
called All My Life. And it's definitely like a major step towards later AMC vibe,
Okay.
but
So for you, that's the first kernel of where you hear it.
yeah, yeah, it's the
Okay.
first time that you can recognize it's him singing,
Oh, okay.
because he has
Okay.
a distinct voice,
Yeah,
and
totally.
so like
Totally.
this is the first time that I'm like, okay, that's Mark Eitzel singing.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so Naked Skinnies, I don't want to push us ahead too fast, but Naked Skinnies eventually give way to the first version of American Music Club is founded in Columbus.
Yeah, so
With
that's something I don't know whether they did it here or whether they moved and then changed it to American Music Club. I don't know the
Now
timeline of
I
that.
am I am almost certainly going to get some of this information wrong here, but my recollection is that, again, thank you, Sean Body, for this book. But my recollection is that Eitzel becomes very good friends with uh I want to say her name is I'm gonna get the last name wrong. Kathleen. The Kathleen of the famous American Music Club song Kathleen. He becomes friends slash potentially lovers with this woman Kathleen, who in his earliest years is kind of like undeniably his muse, or is described frequently as his muse. And they have this very, very close relationship, but no one quite knows exactly what the contours of that relationship are. In any case, I believe that he is there is some early version of the band, and she is the first one to move out to San Francisco from Columbus. And then he goes and they kind of go out there and try and get it back together once they're out there, and it never really happens. And
I don't know if this is correct.
okay, okay, okay. So what do you think is right here? You tell
I
me, and I'm gonna.
and again, this is cobbled together from like memories of interviews I
Yeah,
read and like whatever. But
sure.
I thought that he had the Naked Skinnies here. There, in that band was a guy named Greg Bonnell, who was a drummer,
Yep.
and
Yeah.
there was a woman named Nancy. Um, I don't have her last name here, but she played like organ, I think. And
Yeah.
and then they moved group around those three moved to San Francisco,
Okay.
and I thought Kathleen was someone later, like
No,
out.
no, Kathleen. No,
No?
I've just verified it. I happen to have the book here.
Oh, okay.
Kathleen Burns comes into Eitzel's life during the Cowboys, actually.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Goodness, I
yeah,
didn't realize
and
she was a
so
Columbus. Yeah.
yeah, and was someone who was kind of in and around Eitzel during that period of time. Now, I'm not going to be able to get. Oh, you know what? Ron House. I want to go back to Ron House. I
Okay.
had read this and I forgot about it. You know what Ron House's label was called?
Something House.
Magnolia Thunder Pussy Records. Of
Oh,
course, named after the famous Columbus record store that used to exist, right? Magnolia Thunder Pussy. Wasn't there a record store called
yeah,
Magnolia Thunder?
yeah. There still is. That's like
Yeah.
that's like one of the only. We're still in. Well, maybe not the only one, but like I know Ron House was associated with Used Kids Records for a long time, and that was the one that was across the street from Magnolia Thunder Pussy for a long
Well,
time. But
listen, I mean,
they've moved around, and I don't know. Anyway,
yeah,
there's
I don't know that this is true. I'm just trusting the
okay.
book. But in any case, so there is a group of people from Columbus. This Kathleen woman figures into it pretty prominently. There are the members of the Naked Skinnies that somehow evolve into an early what Sean Body calls Mark I American Music Club. and they
Yeah.
make their way out to San Francisco.
So this is my question to you, having read that book, because I don't
Yeah.
think I've ever heard this
Twice
tidbit.
I've read this book, but my reading
When
comprehension is like, C plus.
when and why did they like change from the Naked Skinnies to American Music Club?
All right, that's a really good
Was it
question.
was it because of membership switch or something?
Yeah, no. So basically, the Naked Skinnies recorded a single. This is in 1981. Okay,
Yeah.
the Naked Skinnies recorded a single, and it just completely flopped. Nobody cared about it, and they
Well,
and
yeah, East
and
kind of like
according to the book, I maybe
yeah.
and then Nancy and Greg, because they felt like as a result of this single flopping, they were just like, you know what, this is not going anywhere. We've got to leave Columbus. We're going to go to San Francisco. So it was
Ah,
Nancy and Greg from the Naked Skinnies that decided to kind of move out to San Francisco. Eitzel did not immediately follow, but he
mm,
did follow relatively shortly thereafter. And once they kind of all landed together in San Francisco, they started to try and, pull together um, a band again.
mm.
But the Naked Skinnies, you see this pattern with Eitzel kind of in these early years. He has a band, but it's kind of like not. I'm going to take a step back. I don't want to play the psychotherapist here, but it seems as though Eitzel in these early years is really unwilling to take on the role of band leader. He is, especially in the early AMC, he is the only one writing songs. And we can get to like what it means to write a song in a little bit, because I think there's an interesting dynamic between Eitzel and Tom Mallon here that's worth talking about. But
Mm.
he kind of doesn't want to like be the guy to put together the band. He doesn't really want to be like the taskmaster.
Mhm.
And when these singles get recorded and released and nothing happens, he frequently is just kind of like, fuck it, I'm gonna go, and he'll like just kind of like disappear on these bands.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
in
the thing,
the early years.
I mean, I wouldn't get the impression it was like, he abandoned the bands when the singles didn't do well, because these singles were just released on this like local indie label, so there wasn't really
I
like it
know, it's
wasn't
not Mick Jagger
you know,
walking away from the Stones at the,
right,
no,
like
this
I
is
mean,
like
it's just like, and
these
all
are
of these people, they're all young people, they're all in flux, like their lives are in flux, they're moving and they're coming and they're going,
they're
and
doing different things, and you got these
yeah,
stories of people going working on tours on cruise ships and stuff. So I understand it. I'm not trying to indict Eitzel, but it's a little bit of a different story than, maybe going to be the first time you hear this comparison in the history of the world, than like a John Bon Jovi or like a Bruce Springsteen. Springsteen early on, the stories are basically, I am putting together this band. I am the boss of this band. I am going to kind of like be the guy who is the showrunner of this band, even the bands before the E Street Band, right?
yeah,
He really was kind of not just the kind of songwriting force, but he was the managerial force of the band. I think Eitzel was a more reluctant songwriting force. What you hear frequently from him in these eras is, I wish the other guys would write songs, but they just don't. And he didn't really want to be the guy to kind of like manage the logistics of the band either, which is understandable. And, again, you got to remember, like you said, at this point, he's 21, 22, 23 years old, right? I mean,
yeah,
he's a young man.
yeah,
Okay, so
yeah.
they
I mean,
get to San Francisco.
okay, yeah. So they, first the other two go, and then Eitzel follows them sometime
Mm.
after. Now,
Yeah,
sometime before he leaves Columbus, though, he makes a demo tape,
that's
just
right. Critical piece of
home
information.
recordings, and I'm not
Yep.
even sure what it's recorded on exactly, but it's got to be like an early like 4-track
Got
machine
to be a
kind of
four
deal.
track. We all had one at our house, right? The what was the brand of that 4-track?
Tascam, but this is 81, 82, and so it's
Yeah,
like I don't,
could have
it's
been
like
a
I
real
don't
like a,
I don't know how they did it back then. But
yeah.
anyway, he self-records, I think with the help of Greg B and I saw someone else's name on there as well, but this cassette tape called Mean Mark Eitzel Gets Fat, and puts it out. Now, and did you look at the track listing of this cassette
So
tape?
walk us through it. Walk us through it, J-Dub.
There are track one. Well, there are a few songs on here. Most of it is stuff that I don't know and I couldn't track down. I have the track listing, but I only heard a few of the actual tracks. So
Yeah.
Swing Low, You Can Be Beautiful, I Speak French, Tall Black Lady,
Yeah.
Hold On to Your Love.
Yep. Yep.
That's
Becomes. Yeah.
This will become the closing track on the Restless Stranger. It first appears on this tape. Keep This Dance for Me. Shadow of My Name, which is
Yes.
the early version of Big Night.
Yes.
Those are the songs that are on this demo tape, and
Yeah.
so you can hear the progression even from the Naked Skinnies. Like it's like songwriting's
Yeah.
developing further, and he's trying
Yeah.
different things, but the styles, song to song, are like wildly different.
Yep.
And this is something that was a little bit of a revelation for me because I always thought of the Restless Stranger as sort of like the weird first album that
Yeah.
it didn't have as cohesive of like a feel or whatever.
Yeah.
You can hear like in this demo tape and in these other early recordings and stuff, like the styles are all over the place. And
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
there's some stuff that's like dance. It's like dancey.
Yeah.
It's got more of like a dance beat to it and stuff that
Yeah.
you would dream of hearing AMC do a few years later
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah.
So
I mean, listen, I think it's, it goes to this again, once we get into the Restless Stranger, I think we're gonna end up having to talk about that a lot, and that is something that really struck me when I re-listened to the Restless Stranger here. Um, how kind of all over the place it was from a genre perspective, but there are undeniable moments of the AMC that becomes the AMC that we all know on there. But
mhm.
there are not that many of them, right? It's not like that is the preponderance of the kind of tone of the Restless Stranger. There's at least as much other stuff that is interesting in its own way, but just kind of there are these threads that never really get chased down by the band, right?
Yeah.
There is another thread in the multiverse where the band goes down those kind of threads, and it's a very different band, right? But we'll get to that in a minute. So the Naked Skinnies,
Yeah.
they're in Columbus. They move out to San Francisco. There's not a lot going on with the Naked Skinnies. Kathleen is out there. Eitzel takes a job at a selling condo and car rental packages. That's his day job. And he's basically kind of not doing much musically, but he's writing a lot. And it's around this time that, from what I understand from this book, that he gets introduced to Nick Drake.
Really?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, Nick
In his
Drake, he died in the 70s.
No, I know, but Eitzel was not a fan. He had
Oh,
been
you
introduced to Nick, not Nick.
I thought you meant literally introduced. I was like,
No,
no, this is not correct.
no, this
We
is
can't
amazing.
put
Nick Drake, the ghost of Nick Drake, shows up
okay.
in Eitzel's apartment in the Tenderloin.
Right.
All right, so he's in San Francisco. He's brought the Mean Mark Eitzel demo with him, and he starts to play around. He falls in with a kind of a community of like-minded musicians and people that revolve around a sandwich shop in San Francisco, and meets a lot of people through that. And eventually, I'm fast forwarding a little bit because I do want to kind of like keep us moving a bit. He eventually meets Vudi. Okay. Vudi at this point is playing in a band called the Farmers. And the Farmers, from what we from what I've read, are described as almost a jazz fusion, very avant-garde, out there kind of a band that Vudi is in. Vudi is substantially older. He's almost 10 years older than Eitzel.
Oh wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, he's Eitzel, I believe at the time that they recorded The Restless Stranger, Eitzel is like 23, 24, and Vudi is like 30, 31.
Oh,
So quite a bit, especially in at that age. 30 seems pretty old for somebody who's
yeah.
24, right? But Vudi essentially is so impressed with Eitzel's songwriting, and Eitzel has had such kind of a tumultuous experience with, like, you know, musicians coming and going, and he's not really doing anything steadily. He's just kind of like playing randomly here and there. Vudi says, the quote in the book is, he is one of the best songwriters I've ever heard, and he deserves to have a good band. The sense that I've gotten only from what's written in this book, and this is not my personal opinion, that I've not heard enough of this, like these early recorded demos from these other bands, to have much of an opinion myself. But my sense is that Eitzel is really playing with people who primarily come out of this avant-garde punk aesthetic that maybe are frankly just not very good musicians technically. And Vudi is a substantially better musician technically. And so Vudi is the person who says to Eitzel directly, I am going to put you together. I'm going to put a band together for you that's like a good band that can like play these songs. And Eitzel basically says, okay, well, if you can do that, then I'll do it. But like, he just lets Vudi do it. And so that's how the folks who end up becoming really the first kind of professional version of American Music Club start to gather around. So Bruce Caffin was a part of that group, although he didn't join the band initially. He was a Vudi affiliate from the very earliest days. Pearson was part of that group, right? Basically, the entire lineup that appears on The Restless Stranger is ultimately kind of brought together by Vudi.
The one guy I want to talk about, one
Okay.
guy I want to talk about that I feel like maybe he predates Vudi is this keyboard player, Bruce Johnson, or Brad
Yeah.
Johnson. I'm sorry, geez. My question is, so in doing my research for this episode,
Yeah.
I somehow found these old GeoCities pages, one
Oh,
of which documents American Music Club and Mark Eitzel live and rare recordings, and it's just a list that this person, you know,
put together.
piled. And so they have all of these early recordings from pre-AMC,
Yeah.
including like Naked Skinnies demos and things like that. And they have dates attached to them. So, right in this period that we're talking about 1984, some demos start to get recorded. I assume these are the Tom Mallon
Yeah.
demos
If it's
that we referenced
84, they've
earlier.
got to be the Mallon demos.
Yeah, so these are, these have been packaged together on the black market as restless or alternative Restless Stranger demos or whatever. So one of these demo recordings says that Brad Johnson plays on tracks 1 through 5, and then
Yeah.
Greg Bonnell
Yeah.
like 6 through 11 or something.
Yeah.
And so I feel like this is the period where Greg and Nancy are still kind of in the
Yes.
Eitzel world. Somehow Brad Johnson gets into that world, but I don't know if that happened because of Vudi or that happened before Vudi. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I am not going to give you a specific reaction to that. But I will say my sense from the book is that there is a contingent of people that Eitzel moves out from Columbus with, and is involved with, like the post Naked Skinnies people, and I would assume they have some people that are kind of in and around them. And then he encounters Vudi, who is older. He is from a substantially more established kind of musical cohort in San
yeah, he's been
Francisco.
around.
Yeah, but these are not big bands. It's not like,
Yeah.
he's playing in Jefferson Airplane. He's like, these are very unknown bands also, but they've been around in San Francisco for a while. And some of them are actually like, um, make their living as a musician, like Bruce Cavan, for example. Um,
Mhm.
I think Vudi brought in kind of his crew, and there's some period of time where Eitzel is like kind of partially has his old crew and partially has Vudi's crew, and
Yes.
you know what I mean? He's playing with all these people, but there isn't really a coalesced like American Music Club, even as a band that like thinks of itself as a band. It's more like people who are playing with Eitzel here and there, and then it's whoever
Yeah.
kind of goes in and records with them on a given day, right?
And I think that the Restless Stranger ultimately, that's sort of the weirdness of the album, is that it's sort of a meshing of those two
Yeah.
crews, so
Yeah.
to speak. You know,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
because some of these songs obviously date back, some as far as the Columbus demo cassette. And so, and they have very different sound, in those early versions. I think that Columbus crew or whatever, like, you know, as musicians, their sound was different. Like it was, I don't even know how to describe it, but quirkier, or like, and I think like Vudi had a different, maybe, I don't know if, musically that was his vision or whatever, but like just given the people he brought in, they went in the more Americana, you know.
It's really interesting. So, all right, now we're getting into I think the meat of it. We're making our way towards the Restless Stranger. So, Vudi, I want to like distill this down to one narrative that struck me, and I want to see if it works as a framework for you. But my one thing that I've kind of picked up as I've dug deep into the literature on the early era of American Music Club and kind of the early albums is I get the sense that Eitzel is identified by a number of people across in Columbus, in San Francisco. They're they kind of adopt him. They recognize a certain raw talent, a raw performance talent, perhaps a raw songwriting talent, although that's a little less clear. And but they also identify him as a little bit lost. And there are a couple of figures that enter into his life that I would argue, based on these books, I don't know if this is true, but I'm not gonna argue it. I'm gonna throw it out there as something to see if you kind of bite on it. Really take on Eitzel as a project and move American Music Club move it ahead for him, because he is kind of not willing or able to do it himself. The first is Vudi, kind of puts together a band of Vudi's own kind of choosing to essentially back Eitzel, right? And he says that very explicitly. Vudi comes from this background where he has been playing country music to make a living with Bruce Caffin, right? They're playing in these honky tonks down in Half Moon Bay, where I used to live, Pescadero down there. And they're kind of doing that kind of semi-professionally, but they're clearly like musicians that are, working pretty, regularly. And he pulls together that group. And then the second of these people ends up being Tom Mallon, right? Who identifies Eitzel as kind of a raw, unformed talent, and takes the band and Eitzel songs on as a little bit of a personal project. But that is the narrative that I picked up from the earliest years of AMC. Do you buy that?
Yes, I buy that he wasn't interested necessarily, or just
Yeah.
didn't want to take on the role as like band administrator and
Yeah.
de facto manager who's kind of like
Yeah.
getting things done, and like
Yeah.
he was more of the pure
Yeah.
artist, or and obviously like he had the charisma and the magnetic
Yeah.
kind of aura about him that drew people to him and made people want to, I mean, going back to Columbus and,
Yeah.
like I read on one of the things about that early single that he put out, you know, that he was Ron House's quote unquote hero band or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
you know, I think that there was kind of like a recognition that like, oh, this guy's got something, you
Something.
know,
Yeah.
and you
And
know,
you
and so I
hear it.
think,
You
yeah, and
hear it
Vudi saw
frequently.
that.
You hear it frequently in and around kind of the impact he can have in live performances. I think people
Yeah,
observe him play live on good nights. They say like, "Wow, this guy has something that I've never seen before." It is like undeniable. But then there is this kind of how do we take these early proto songs, and it'll be interesting to talk about this,
yeah.
get into
Well,
this. But these, like, unformed kinda songs, and how do we kind of, like, mold them into something that's more discernible as,
yes.
like, a song,
And that's
right?
what I hear now, like, after hearing all the demos and after hearing that early like, I can feel the struggle within
Yeah,
Restless Stranger. Like,
yeah,
they, you know, Tom Mallon and Vudi and the rest of the band, like, they're trying to kinda, like, get this thing into, like, you know, a form
yeah,
that, you know, can be on the radio, can be, you know, like or because
yeah,
Eitzel's coming from this like more performance art, like, but
yeah.
his lyrics have this stream of consciousness kind of
And
feel
you
to
know,
them,
and he
you
says,
know,
like, he'll reinvent the melodies every time he performs the
yes,
song live. It's very improvisational for him, and you get
yes.
more and more of a sense of that on these early albums. But, like, you just brought up Tom Mallon. I think we've gotta move on. We're already, you know,
I
we're gonna have to cut this into, I
I'm
think,
just gonna
3
say, like, should this be
episodes.
2 like, should there be a
We no,
pre-Restless Stranger
we
episode?
will you know what, J-Dub, we will cut this into as many episodes as possible, try and target about an hour an episode, but listen, when the content is rich, you gotta give yourself over to it, right?
Let it flow,
Um,
you gotta let it flow.
but, like, all right, so Tom Mallon, this is a figure that I think is incredibly interesting in the early history of American Music Club. He is, you know, primarily described. My impression of him is really comes primarily through the Sean Body book, right? Um, but he is approached by the band, the Vudi formed version of American Music Club, to do demos. And he is a local punk scene studio owner slash producer who's known to have pretty good engineering chops, and he's willing to kind of work with people on price if he likes the band, right? So they approach him and they go in and record demos. This process both engages Tom Mallon in a very deep way. He is 100% bought into Eitzel and the potential of this band. But simultaneously, he is described across the book as a deeply difficult person who does not get along with any of the band members. He really does not have a lot of time for bad musicianship. He is not trying to make any friends, but he spends exceptional amounts of time working on their demos and ultimately on the Restless Stranger. So he becomes a producer for the band slash guru. He really in this book is described as kind of the primary author of that demo and ultimately of the Restless Stranger. It almost feels to me in reading the book as though Eitzel came in with song fragments and the band came in with kind of rough approaches to how they were going to do this, and Mallon basically pounded it into what he thought the band should look like. And he would, you know, when somebody would record a track that he didn't think was good, he would just say, I'm not using it. That track's awful. I'll just record it myself later. And he would say that right to the band members. You know what I mean? And they would record and then they'd come in the next day and the tracks wouldn't be in the song. And they'd say, what happened to the tracks? He'd be like, I deleted them because they sucked. You guys don't know how to play
Wow.
your instruments. Like, he was incredibly difficult on them. But Eitzel, who is like, well, you know, pretty sensitive guy, like well known to be a pretty sensitive guy, repeatedly in this book is like, listen, Tom was like difficult, but American Music Club would not exist without Tom Mallon. Like, he really kind of took this on as his passion project and forced it into something that kind of seemed like a real thing. And it's such an interesting story, right? I mean, it's not a story from the band that I had ever really heard before or thought about.
Yeah, the only thing that sort of reminds me of is like the way that like Brian Eno,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
not to compare the sound at all or whatever, but
Yeah. Yeah.
like how
Yeah.
he would kind of like get involved with these bands as a producer, but then he would
Yeah.
become a de facto like member of the band, like Tom Mallon started as a producer, or he was just going to record him at his studio, but then he ended up becoming a member of the band and really, you know, trying to lasso this thing
Yeah.
into, what it kind of, got it on the path of what AMC became or whatever. But
Yeah, that's
it's
right.
amazing, have you listened to the Restless Stranger demos at all?
All right. No. So lay
You
this
got to
out.
do the
Lay this.
research. You got to
Okay.
do the research. You got to put in the time. Um, so first of all, there are some songs in this demo collection that do not make the final album.
Yeah.
Second of all, or maybe a song on this and then a song on like one of the other ones where like the music is completely different. Like the backing track is unrecognizably different from
Really.
what made the album. Like different
Yeah.
chords, different style, different
Yeah.
whatever, but the lyrics are more or less the same. And so
Yeah.
I was kind of like, whoa, because there are a couple spots, in the Restless Stranger, and I think in the AMC discography in general, where Eitzel's like his vocal lines or whatever, like
Yeah.
they kind of fragment and they kind of end in strange places. And
Yep.
but like when I listened to the demos where you heard that lyric against this other demo,
Yeah.
it was like that explains the cadence. That explains
Yeah.
why he's delivering the line like this, because it was written
Yeah.
for like an entirely different piece of music. And now,
Yeah.
oh, I don't know.
You
I'm
really get a
ranting.
sense of that. I think you get a sense. I didn't listen to those, but you get a sense of that when you listen to like Songs of Love Live, the early Eitzel solo acoustic record where he does like Room Above the Club, and it's just completely different from the version that appears on the album. Two things that come out of that. One, I think we need to talk about that generally more. Two, we're gonna have to make a decision about whether we're gonna tackle these Eitzel solo records, because I think it's an obvious question that we'll need to deal with. But all right, so they record demos with Tom Mallon, right? The demos, it's a difficult process. The
They're
demos,
all over the place.
they're all
Like
over the place.
style wise, I mean, it almost sounds like different bands, from like demo or from track to track sometimes. Like it's crazy.
It doesn't really go anywhere. And my recollection of the timeline that happens in this, that's laid out in this book, is at this point, after that demo, they pick up and move to Germany
Yeah.
for the
What's up
first.
with that? Like, where did that
Yeah, there
come
was
from?
someone's girlfriend lived there, and there was nothing going on in San Francisco, and so they all just kind of decided to go over. And I might be getting the time of this wrong, but they went over, and then and while they were gone, Mallon decides to start his own record label, which is Grifter. And he decides that he is also somehow affiliated with Thin White Rope as a producer.
Yes. Yes.
And Thin White Rope and American Music Club are going to be, look at that, the Grifter
Yeah.
record
That's the Grifter logo.
logo.
Yeah.
The they are going to be one of the albums that he puts out on Grifter. So he kind of summons them back, and they have to record the version of The Restless Stranger themselves with Mallon for the Grifter release. They've kind of been quote unquote signed, and now they're going to do it, right? And this is like an incredibly difficult process for them. Mallon really kind of steps on a lot of toes, but he hammers this thing into shape, and they eventually get to the place where they've recorded this album. Okay. They do it with keyboard. They do it with, it's the lineup for the band is Norelli on drums, Eitzel, Vudi, Pearson,
John.
what's that?
Brad Johnson.
Yeah, Brad Johnson on keyboard.
Not the quarterback for the Vikings from whenever.
Yeah, on keyboards, I believe, right? And that's it, right? And Pearson is playing bass at this point in the band, I believe.
Yes, that is the lineup as listed on the album.
Yeah, and so they record the album. There is a deal done with another label to act as the distributor. The label is called Frontier Records, but it really seems like essentially Grifter is an imprint for the work that what's it, Morale?
Mallon.
Mallon is an imprint for the work that Mallon is doing for free, basically in his studio. He's basically like, recording these bands for free, doing the production work for free. He calls that a label. And then Grifter does the distribution. And that's ultimately how the first album ends up getting its release.
Yeah, so this is Grifter release number 1, GROO1.
Wow, and you've got the vinyl right there.
Ooh.
Okay,
this was actually on my behalf from a college radio station that will remain nameless.
Oh, wow.
Not the one that we worked for, a different one.
Really?
Yeah.
All right, so J-Dub, listen, we've spent almost 2 hours talking about the prehistory of AMC. I think now is a good time for us to break this off, come back in episode 2 and actually dig into side 1 of The Restless Stranger.
We finally got to the first album. We're here, people.
But that is a lot of history that we've covered. We've probably gotten a lot of it wrong. Please write in and let us know.
Absolutely.
J-Dub,
we're not experts. We're just fans. We're trying to understand.
We're trying to wind our way through our own love for the band. So listen, if you want to let us know all the ways that we've screwed this up, get in touch with us. On Reddit, you can find us at Backtracking Rocks ROX. On Twitter, at Backtracking Rocks ROX. On Instagram, at Backtracking Rocks. At Backtracking Rocks ROX. And finally, on email, that is my preferred method of communication, obviously, because I'm not an idiot. It is backtrackingrocksrox@gmail.com.
Gen X.
So we will be back next week with episode 2 of season 2 of Backtracking, covering the first side of the Restless Stranger. J-Dub, how was your first time setting sail?
Made it. I listen. I realize a lot of you people are out there. You're listening to this right now, and you're like, "I miss Roth." Roth will be back, maybe for season 3.
We'll see.
Dan's probably already got season 3 lined up.
Listen, I've got some bands that I've got potential co-hosts, and I've got potential bands that are being bandied around.
He's got a podcast in every port.
I've got one thing to focus on, and that's AMC. That's Restless Stranger. So we are going to see you guys next week for side 1 of The Restless Stranger. Bye-bye.